Well, welcome to another episode of the Puget Podcast. Today I have with me Dr. Don Kinghorn, who is our resident mad scientist here at Puget Systems. Today we're going to be taking a look back and looking at the previous decade and what the major changes have been, as well as what are the major players over the past decade and how they've impacted the industry. But before we dive into that, Don, why don't you kind of introduce yourself, and for those that aren't familiar, kind of explain what your background is and what your role is here at Puget.
Okay. It's Dr. Kinghorn. The doctor refers to PhD in theoretical chemistry back in whenever it was, mid 90s, something like that. And mathematics before that. So that's and along with all that, I was a theoretician. So that means computers. Okay. And if you think about back to 90s, that kind of means computers from when things really kind of started rolling.
Right.
So I have a very broad perspective on the industry overall. I've worked in business, with in the computer industry for quite some time too. So broad perspective in scientific computing and computers in general. I was one of the first people to start doing cluster computing. So
you've been around from the beginning.
Been around from the beginning. I've seen a lot of it, and so it's really nice. It gives me a way to kind of, when I think back and stuff and look at how things went, it's like, oh yeah, okay, I have.
Seems like it would kind of give you a cool perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and a lot of people just don't know the history of where things came and why things are the way they are now.
Right.
And so, but and like I said, I've worked, I've done thousands of computers.
Wow.
Probably, maybe thousands.
Wow.
including working with 2 top 500 supercomputers. And GPU computing from the very, very, very first days of it.
Yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about what your work looked like before you were here at Puget? Before Puget, well, it was kind of interesting. Going from being a graduate student, little story about it's like, well, how do you know so much about computers and all this kind of stuff? And it's like, well, there's a thing, when you're a graduate student, you look for all these interesting ways to avoid working on your thesis. And fortunately, I had a great advisor, Ron Pashusta, and he gave me a lot of freedom to be distracted. To avoid your work, sure.
To avoid my work. So it's like, what do you do when you're stuck on your thesis? You read a book.
Right.
Repeat as needed. But I was fortunate to have like a really nice workstation on my desk. I had one of Steve Jobs' masterpieces, the Next.
Oh, okay.
And so I learned how to take care of Unix. Learned Unix system administration, programming in C and Fortran and Perl and Python from day one.
Wow.
Did all that stuff, and because I had a Next, it means I was one of the first people to click a hyperlink. Because the Next computer, there was a few people that had these, and they were doing the development work in CERN, and they had some software. The first kind of browser was text browser.
Okay.
And if you had a Next, you could just grab that source code and compile it and run it, and bingo, you were the first people on the World Wide Web.
Wow.
So that's the perspective I've got on where things are now. A lot of people was like, can't even imagine that.
Oh, absolutely.
But that was so lots of nice distractions when I was a grad student. I did eventually buckle down and do some really nice work. I also, it was very, very heavily mathematics. My thesis work was on it was applications of matrix differential calculus and quantum mechanics.
Oh, easy stuff, right?
Easy stuff.
Yeah.
So I have this big background in a lot of really kind of bizarre and interesting mathematics, which turns out to be the same kind of stuff you do with modern the machine learning AI stuff that's going on. It's all the same. And because of that background, almost any scientific computing, HPC stuff, it's like, yeah, I know what they're doing. So that's why I'm wind up being such a great resource for the sales guys, because it's very rare that somebody will ask sales, because we always ask them what they're doing.
Let's take a step back here and talk more about what your role looks like here at Puget now.
Okay.
And then we can kind of segue into that. Yeah.
Okay. At Puget.
Yeah.
Okay. So bringing all that here, it's like, yeah, I'm the scientist guy here. So I'm the scientific computing advisor. That's my official title.
Sure.
But that means a lot of things, and it means advising, a lot of internal advising. So, and also I've been doing Linux since day one. So and Unix before that. So I have that background for helping everybody here when any of those kind of crazy problems come up. And then on the HPC side, I mean, I've been up to my elbows with that since it really was kind of a thing. So I can advise on that. Even though we mostly focus on workstations, that's still really a big deal, because the workstations now are as capable as the big clusters were, back when I was doing clusters.
Sure. So
the same kind of problems come up. But then that puts me in a really good position for advising for sales. A customer comes in, somebody says, "Oh, okay, I want to do some molecular dynamics stuff. I'm doing this and this. I'm doing some genome research. I'm doing sequence analysis. Almost anything." And it's like, well, okay, yeah, I've done that.
Sure.
I know what and even when I don't know specifically, because every now and then somebody's doing something like, whoa, okay, that is really cool. I can usually go and look it up and go, oh yeah, this is really interesting. So the problems fall into certain classes of the computational underpinnings of what's going on.
Sure. And I'm glad you kind of brought up specific use cases, because I'm really interested in what use cases you tend to get brought into more often when you're working with sales.
Well, the things that come up the most are machine learning, AI, and molecular dynamics. Those are the most common, partly because I write about them. I do benchmarks, I do hardware testing, and all that, and plus, I do that stuff. I'm more of a pure quantum chemist myself rather than dynamics.
Sure.
But I mean, that's all been a part of stuff, for ages, and really super. I mean, those are applications where you can do amazing work with a workstation, a GPU accelerated workstation. So those are the things I usually get called in for, because sales is going, I don't know what he's talking about.
Sure.
We try to ask people, what it is that they're really doing, not just general, but actually a little bit more specific detail.
Well, it seems like specifically this industry, it tends to be a lot more project dependent than other use cases might be.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the best hardware for a given task can vary widely, not just within a given domain like molecular dynamics, but what it is actually that they're doing.
Right.
The size of the problems that they're doing, and whatever. There's lots of variables, that kind of being able to advise on that kind of really just comes from experience of, just kind of knowing how computers work, knowing what the underlying mathematics, what's actually implemented on the computer, and how that's going to work and how that's going to affect what's being done.
Right.
So I can usually make a pretty good recommendations on what to do, and then sales is like, thank you.
Before we jump into kind of looking back at the previous decade, can you talk a little bit about, because even talking about molecular dynamics and machine learning, even just talking about those things that's still very vague. Could you obviously, without talking about any customer specifically, can you talk a little bit about specifically the work that people are trying to do within these use cases?
Okay, just back into molecular dynamics.
Sure.
That domain. The whole idea there is to do simulations of molecular systems. Okay, and this could be something like a protein. You're trying to understand, like maybe how a protein is folding, or problems with maybe like docking, like how a drug might interact with some kind of protein or something like that. The molecular dynamics is usually like really big systems, and that's...
So this would be someone doing potentially like drug research?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And and you can use molecular dynamics to look at materials research. You look at interactions, and then look at okay, how does something react when it's in water? How and it all comes down to computing energy levels and stuff like that, and trying to find structures of how things move. What the dynamics are like, how
Right.
things change over time. Huge computational problem, massive computational problem. That is a problem that is traditionally in the supercomputing realm, and
And now that's being able to be done on workstations.
Yes, absolutely, especially because of accelerated computing, GPUs.
Sure.
And that was an area actually where GPU acceleration worked really well early on. It wasn't so great in the early days because the computational power wasn't there.
Okay. So problems just took too long to solve, basically.
Problems took too. I mean, and they still. It's amazing. Yeah. If you look at how, I benchmarked with NAMD. If you look, it's a great program to benchmark with because it has excellent CPU scalability, multi-node scalability, and excellent GPU scalability.
Nice.
So it's a great program to benchmark with. But if you look at the output, if you look at what you're measuring, and when you do, and I usually use actually fairly large systems, like maybe 1 million atoms, something like that, right? And the results are measured in days per nanosecond. Okay.
That puts things in perspective.
That puts things in perspective. How complicated these problems really are. Especially in the early days of the molecular dynamics, it was like days, weeks, months to compute just a fraction, small fraction of a second, a nanosecond.
That's wild.
It's small, right?
Yeah.
It's a billionth of a second. Okay, but processes happen on a molecular level very, very quickly. But still, I mean, that's the complexity of the problem.
Right.
And that it's a very interesting problem because that's basically it's more classical mechanics than it is quantum mechanics. So it's computing all these forces and stuff like that more in a classical manner. So you can do these huge problems. And the computational capability is what drove that forward. And this has been happening in the sciences for a long, long time. If you look back, to the modern era of the quantum mechanics era, it was like we had this most beautiful theory ever, and there's like great, but you can't do it with pencil and paper. I mean, you can, and they did. The word computer, this is open to debate. But the word computer came from Hilleross's lab, where he had come up with a way to actually compute some energy levels for atoms, right? And but to do the calculations, there wasn't even computers really, So it was a room full of secretaries with calculators.
Oh, right, yeah.
And we're punching all these numbers in and doing these calculations. And they called the people doing the calculations computers.
Right, yeah.
Those are our computers. Okay? So anyway, it's the increase in computing performance has driven the science forward. because you had a lot of work that was done in the 50s and 60s that was just brilliant, but it couldn't really be implemented well. You couldn't do it.
Yeah.
You couldn't actually compute.
The scale at what you could compute wasn't there. Yeah.
So as computing capability got better, it's like, oh, actually, we can actually do this now. And that's, so advances in computing capability often drive science forward, and probably more so than a lot of people realize.
So I think that's a great segue actually into what we actually want to talk about here, specifically this past decade. So let's start 10 years ago. Where were we? What was the state of the hardware industry and what you were actually able to accomplish?
Okay, yeah, this is actually really pretty interesting, because where we were, 2010, where we were at the end of the 2000s.
Sure.
2000s is when we started doing cluster computing. Linux took hold, and that was the birth of the modern supercomputing era. And CPUs were good. They were this was in the 2000s. This is when AMD was really killing with the Opteron. They had higher core counts. These were just great platforms. Intel was struggling because AMD was being innovative, 64-bit, right? It's AMD 64, sorry, Intel. But yeah, so that's kind of where things were. And another really, really interesting thing happened in the 2000s that maybe you might not really think about this very often. But towards the end of the 2000s, gaming was getting really, really good. You had the PlayStation came out. Just, it was killer. It was awesome.
Yeah.
And Nvidia and ATI at the time, before AMD got them, the video cards were getting really, really good. They were getting good, and it was if you're a scientist and you're sitting here going, okay, I'm going to run this job. You're trying to get every bit of performance because you're waiting weeks, months for a calculation to finish. It's like, we need more.
For potentially 1 nanosecond.
We want more, yeah. Right. And so you start looking at things like, wow, and maybe 2006, 2007, right around in there. Nvidia had the GeForce, the 8800.
Okay.
That GPU was really, really good. And it was good enough that people started looking at it and going, wow. And they started playing the numbers games. Like, okay, this will do this many shaders, whatever, all these performance measurements. And if you're a computational, you're a chemist, you're scientist, whatever, you're going, I want that. It's like, wow,
taking it outside of the context of gaming.
It's like, man, those are really capable processors, because we were frustrated with what we could do on CPU, and so everybody just was starting to look at how can we accelerate what we're doing. Are there special chips that we can use? Is there something that we can do to speed things up? We can just, what can we do? And one of the things was people started looking at the video cards and going, well, what's actually going on in a video card? And it's like, okay, these are the little 4 vectors in here for computing shaders, whatever, however all this works. And it's like, oh, that's a vector. I know about vectors. I'm a scientist, right?
Sure.
So you start going, oh, well, maybe I can actually do something with a video card with a shader language and fool the video card into actually doing a calculation, maybe doing a matrix multiplier or something, a fundamental operation. And sure enough, it was possible. I played around with this stuff a little bit, just hacking in that sense of the word.
Right.
Hacked around with trying to get some, and other people were doing this. It's like, wow, okay, yeah, this is actually really pretty fast, but it was huge pain. And then there's a few pivotal points, but right there at the end of the 2000s, people were looking at this stuff, and they were trying to do things. And Nvidia took notice that whoa, okay, these guys are actually like trying, these hacker mad scientists are trying to do calculations on our GPUs. Cool.
Yeah.
So and ATI was doing it too. It's like, okay, well, what can we do to make this easier so that they can actually do this? And Nvidia came up with CUDA. ATI had an approach that was more low level, more like a machine level, and it was just a little bit too close. It was called close to the metal at one point, and it was too difficult to work with.
Gotcha.
But Nvidia worked up some libraries that you could use with C. They had an Nvidia C compiler, the preprocessor, that you could write little kernels that you could offload to the GPU and run in the context of C, and it was not mind-numbingly difficult to do. It was not easy because you had to manage memory, you had memory transfers from the CPU side to the GPU side, and you had to buffer everything. You had to manage stuff a lot, but it was actually possible to do.
Right.
And that was. I had to actually check the dates on that. It looks like the first CUDA came out in about 2007.
Okay.
And so people jumped on it, started putting things together. And then I went to a symposium or workshop, something at NCSA, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications in Urbana-Champaign.
Okay.
And it was a workshop for everybody that was actually tinkering around with accelerators. And the PlayStation that had an IBM chip in it called the Cell BE, Cell Broadband Engine. Intel or IBM made a version of that chip for like more serious kind of compute stuff. And so at San Diego Supercomputer Center, they actually put a bunch of these things together and it was a brilliant talk that this guy gave, because it was like they spent all this time, they did all this, they finally actually got some code written and a calculation to run. But he gave this most brilliant and hilarious presentation, and it was like, yeah, this is not worth it. This just didn't work. And so there was all these kind of things going on there, but there was people doing GPU stuff, and including Todd Martinez, who's a great quantum chemist, computational chemist. Yeah. He was there at University of Illinois at the time, and he's at Stanford now. He's a Stanford professor there, but he started working on some quantum chemistry code that was GPU accelerated. And so he was working together with a brilliant Russian researcher that was working with him at the time, and I can't remember his name. But so they did this, Terracam, and I was working at Parallel Quantum Solutions at the time, so I really wanted to talk to Todd, and it's like, Todd, this is brilliant. This stuff is great. Because I've been messing around with GPUs, and I've been messing around with CUDA, and I was going, yeah, this is it. He was kind of like running the symposium a little bit, and at the end of the conference, everybody. It was a small group. There was maybe 40 people there.
Oh wow.
Yeah, this was people that were actually doing this stuff at the time.
Right.
Okay, there was not a whole lot.
Yeah.
But it was at the end of the thing. It's like Todd's going, okay, what have we learned? What have we got here? It's like, okay, this is it. The way forward is we're going to use GPUs. We're going to use Nvidia GPUs and CUDA. It's the only thing that makes any sense, and it was the only thing that made any sense. And
when was this?
That was, okay, this was after CUDA, so it had to have been after 2007. It may have been 2008 or 2009.
Okay. And when was the moment then that it kind of took off at being accessible kind of at scale?
Oh, I'm getting to that.
Oh, okay. I don't want to get too far ahead of you.
I'm setting the stage.
Okay.
I'm setting the stage. So this was the end of the 2000s. It was like, okay, here we go. And oh man, okay, what? Yeah, this is part of my like Nvidia tech company of the decade thing, right? When I thought about doing that, I thought about, okay, what really happened in the decade?
Well, spoiler alert, I was saving that for the end. But.
Oh, no, well, okay. But it was like, okay, it's Nvidia. This was hugely significant. The GPUs. This all kind of started with that GeForce 8800 and CUDA 1. The first issue of CUDA.
Sure.
And then Nvidia went, okay, hey, let's make a GPU for specifically for compute. So the very first Tesla C what would they call it? C870, C860. That didn't have graphics output. I mean, this was for compute. So Nvidia went all in.
Right.
It's like, okay, we're serious about this. We're going to support this community. And they just kept developing this. They just kept going forward with this. That got up into, the 9800 GeForce cards, and then the Tesla and the Quadros were all being used for this. Right up to about 2010, right at the start of the decade, the CUDA was still still fairly early, but it was maturing rapidly. Nvidia was brilliant with this. What Nvidia defined what a ecosystem is for development. As far as I'm concerned, they did it. They defined it, and the ecosystem for CUDA devs was just fantastic. They showcased everything that everybody was doing. Everything was public. They kept cranking on CUDA, trying to make things better and better. They started doing educational things. And
now, was that due to the fact that they knew that was the direction everyone was trending, or was it being adopted at that rate as well? Or both, I guess.
Both.
Yeah.
But they were making their money. They weren't making big money from this. They were making their money from gaming.
Right.
This is what supported all that. But Nvidia had the foresight and the nobility to do this. To actually, like, okay, this is a great thing to do. So they supported the computing, GPU accelerated computing. They supported it all out, and they dumped their money into it. That's what they moved it forward, and they just did a brilliant job. And this really took off right about 2010. You had the GTX 280, 285. Those you might remember some of those. Is it Houston? You might remember
too early for me.
Those cards were fantastic. They were stable. The performance was great. It was very clear this was like way better than doing this stuff on CPU.
Gotcha.
Like, this is definitely going to go forward. And that was the GTX 280, 295 was a dual GPU one, and that was the Tesla C160, C1 or 1060, 1070, and that cemented it. That was a no-brainer. Everybody was doing this because anybody could go out and get one of these cards. You could afford it and tinker and try it, and so it exploded. Everybody was trying to port code to the GPU, trying to do it.
Right.
And it was obvious that was the way forward, and that starts into the decade now, and because people wanted something better than CPU, they wanted something to accelerate their codes, and this was obviously it. So that started the decade. Now, so I laid the thing. Now what was your question? Your original question? You said
just looking back 10 years ago, kind of what was the state of things. So I think that was the state of things
right there at the beginning of the decade.